Hello everyone, this is Many Ninja speaking. Welcome to this review for the Demoniacal Fit Tenacious Martialist figure, which, if we're being totally honest, is basically an unapologetic clone figure of the Ultra Instinct signed Goku, which is the event exclusive from this year's brand of convention exclusives that didn't quite happen, as well as a few other bits and pieces here that are meant to kind of spice up the pot for a little less than what the official figure went for. As we take a quick look over the packaging before we get to the nitty-gritty of it all, I just want to remind you that this figure has been teased for some time, for I'm going to say roughly a year or so, but the original 3D render that it was put out doesn't quite match up what we have here, because this, as I was saying, is unapologetically based off the event exclusive figure, which I'm going to guess they got a hold of somehow earlier, and pretty much made a clone copy of the body. As you can imagine, based on the original Chosen One's release, this particular clone figure does have a few bells and whistles extra, which are meant to kind of get you to buy this version rather than the original one. Alongside the cheaper price, of course, they also have an extra set of heads, namely the Super Saiyan Blue heads and faces, an extra Jiren head, which as far as I can tell is entirely custom to this set, as well as a specialty stand, which is entirely based off the event exclusive stands that came out in the 2020 year, which is this year just for those watching. Removing the figure from the packaging itself, it's a nice tidy clamshell, so it's at least a decent quality, and based on initial impressions as we're getting the figure out there, presentation wise, not that bad. The vast majority of the figure has a nice matte finish onto it, although as you can probably see from the footage, that does not necessarily apply to the upper part of the shirt there, which has a noticeably glossy finish, almost rifling the hair at this point, which is indeed a bit weird and kind of ill-fitting with the rest of the figure as a whole here. In terms of the articulation bit, as you see me doing the test here, most of the joints I can report do seem to work relatively well, if a bit snug if anything, but this is right out of the packaging, although that's not to say that the joints have no issues whatsoever. In my case, while it's not really a huge issue, one of the hands does keep popping off there. The right hand is a bit loose on the wrist joint, and I find the waist joint is a bit really stiff actually, and the hip joint, as you can see, we're once again having the same issue with the right hip joint, which at least in this case makes a little more sense, as I can tell it's because it's getting caught on the upper part of the hip cover. So at least I can understand why it's happening this time around, but it is something that keeps popping up in Demoniacal Fit releases. It's a tad odd, I find. And the joints themselves, as you can see here, different color matching with what's going on the front there, so that's perfectly nice. And in terms of the rest of the body, everything seems to be moving pretty well. Maybe the ankle joints are a bit loose if anything, but they're still workable. Toe joints are just fine. Here's what it looks like when you have the stand assembled. So it's got a nice circular base on there with the arms that are holding him in place. Although it's a bit of a newer design, it takes a little while getting used to. I do like how the claw does do a better job actually holding the figure up, because it also offers some support beneath the figure, which is a very nice change of pace on that one, compared to the older style stands. Does a good job. Accessories, when you have them laid out here, kind of indicates that the vast majority of them are leaning towards the head and faces of Goku in this case, which, if you look here, here's what it looks like for the Ultra Instinct side head. Very nice metallic finish on it, partially speckled and everything. Kind of a pearlescent to a certain degree, especially if you have better lights. And if I could get the footage to... Admittedly, it's getting hard to get something this scale in focus, so bear with me a second. Yeah, nice sharp decals on there, and you can even see the etchings of the faceplates, which means that it's definitely a good copy of what the signed faces had. General look on there. You can see these are relatively built the same way as you would have with the standard faces. Although for some reason the inside of the mouths are a different color now that I notice on these two faces. But it's also worth noting, as we kind of look on the details here, there's etching faces on the side faces. However, all of the blue faces are clean etching, or actually clean without any etches or any kind of scratches. So that does stand out a bit on this particular figure, which is a little more on the beat up side. Yep, there's your closed eye thing, so all your side faces are accounted for. And all the faces you see here for the Super Saiyan Blue ones pretty much are the ones that come straight with the releases of the movie Broly Super Saiyan Blue head, so that's to be expected. As for the one unique head in this case, being Jiren, it's honestly really nicely handled. Maybe not the cleanest casting on the inside, but it's a nice matte finish. Color-wise, it seems to match up with what you expect for Jiren, and it's a very interesting expression. It's something you didn't get with the original figure, which was kind of boring in terms of expressions. However, what's something that isn't exactly too exciting to talk about, the hands here are basically your bog standard Goku hands. He only gets 4 pairs of hands with this release because most of it went towards the heads and faces, and they're basically open palm, these grabby hands, and your martial arts hands on top of the fists. Quick look at the joints here, which as you can see are pretty much your bog standard fare, but it is worth reporting that the actual switching between the various heads and hands is honestly generally painless this time around. At least on the model I have here, I don't have to do anything special in this case, no heat gun, no hot water even, in order to get the head to be able to switch back and forth, and same thing with the hands. If anything, maybe the hands are a little too loose, I would say, maybe slightly undersized or poorly fitted, because on at least the right hand, it does seem to feel a little looser on there, although they do manage to still hold their poses well enough, as long as you're not messing around with the angles too much, but at least they can be popped back in with no real hassle. So, no need for a drill bit this time. That is a very excellent change of place. And we're going to quickly take a look at what the other hands and hands look like in place for the Ultra Instinct head, because that is the more unique one. There we go, and closed eyes. The accessories aren't entirely perfect, however. As you can see here with the Jiren head, it doesn't actually properly fit in, at least on mine, without having to heat it up a bit first. Otherwise, the opening is actually a bit too small and will just kind of stand here like a pinhead on top of everything. Although for extra proof of concept here, the head being suspended there is actually the one from this particular bootleg, which you can see can be made to use the Jiren accessory, that is the hair grabbing bit, although there is a bit difference in the paint job. Yep, it's slightly darker on the real one. Here's what it looks like with the Jiren head being properly in place. As you can see, it will be able to fit on there. You just need to take some hot water on it. And in this case, I'm showing the Goku thing without the headband because it's worth noting Goku's hair on both of the heads are actually using translucent plastic, which does mean you have to be careful not to scratch it, otherwise it will show, just for the record. Now we have a side-by-side between the Tenacious Martialist as well as the movie Broly figure. And as you can kind of see here as I'm kind of doing a quick part swap, yep, there is pretty much its exact same casting, although I find the pegs on the Tenacious Martialist figure are a bit shorter if anything. So as you can see, it does make a fit, although it's not a perfect fit. There is a slight difference in the casting there, and it's actually a bit more troublesome than it looks in this particular shot to keep it in place sometimes. And you kind of have to really push it in order to get it to stay firmly in place. However, the one from the official figure will fit on the bootleg one a bit better because the pegs are a bit longer, I find. Now, in terms of whether or not you need to, or you can actually use the bootleg faces on the real head, it is something that indeed can be done, although it's worth noting that the bootleg faces also have slightly shorter pins than what the real one have, so you kind of have to lean back in order to put in, because otherwise they won't hold particularly well, I find. Yeah, that's one popping up because it was normally it's held with a little more pressure for the pins, but it's missing in this case because the pegs are just like a millimeter too short. It's also worth noting that while they do fit on there and actually look pretty decent, the skin tone on the bootleg, or on the Tenacious Martialist, is slightly darker than what the movie Broly figure has, so it may be hard to see in this footage, but it does stand out a little bit in person. I actually prefer the skin tone on the Tenacious Martialist, just for the record. The extra little tan makes it a little better, I find. Now, if you're wondering what's wrong with this footage, as the figure is still very intact at the point of this, well, unfortunately, I haven't worked out how to best do the teardown on this particular toy just yet. And for the reason that is twofold. One, it's actually particularly well built together, meaning everything is a very nice tight fit on there. Which subsequently is also why I'm afraid to try to separate it. It's very tightly fit. Too tight, in fact. I'm actually leaving the original audio from this particular video bit I was recording on here so you can hear for yourself why I'm concerned, and that's going to be not necessarily in shoulder pegs, but more the upper torso and stuff, which you will be hearing yourself in a second. For those not familiar, that is the sound of a figure that is very tightly fitted. To the point that while it isn't going to affect the figure's movement itself in regular usage, and probably over time it will happen to loosen a bit there and not be as squeaky, I'm afraid that if I were to try to exert the normal amount of force I normally have to use in order to separate these figures sometimes, those pegs are going to break for sure. And considering that honestly I've really enjoyed this figure up to this point, I honestly don't want to do that just yet. So until I can figure out how to safely do so, we're going to have to do a little bit of a moratorium on the teardown footage for this particular figure. And that pretty much sums up my general view of this. As you can probably guess, it's positive with a lot of good reasons. This does make us a good, cheaper alternative for the much harder to get and much more expensive by this point event exclusive Ultra Instinct sign figure from the official P Bandai source. So yeah, if you're looking for a filler version, this one will certainly do the trick. As well as just have a few extra bells and whistles you can hopefully use for your displays, because this one's going in mine. Thanks for watching, catch you all later.